The Arizona sun dipped low over the horizon, staining the desert sky in shades of copper and blood orange. Heat shimmered on the mesas, and the air held that peculiar stillness that comes when the day is almost spent, but not yet surrendered to night. In the middle of this vast quiet stood Greyhawk Estate, an improbable palace of glass and stone, its modern towers glinting like knives against the ancient earth. It was wealth pressed into the shape of a fortress, a symbol of everything the world had taken from the Apache, and then tried to give back in money. Inside, Talon Greyhawk, the young heir to the empire, leaned against a wide window and watched the sun die behind the saguaros. He was barely 27, tall, sharp-featured, and restless, the kind of man who looked carved rather than born. His ancestors had hunted these same lands long before fences or oil rigs. Now those lands stretched under his name in a tangle of deeds and bank accounts that he neither celebrated nor fully understood. He had inherited more than property. He had inherited a silence that felt older than him. Talon's father, Wesley Greyhawk, had been the first to bridge two worlds. Half Apache, half European, he became a legend of business, discovering oil beneath the sacred valleys and turning the family's name into a brand known from Phoenix to New York. When he died suddenly, a heart attack in the middle of a corporate gala, newspapers called it a tragedy of wealth, but the tribal elders called it a consequence. Talon never asked what they meant by that. He didn't want to believe in curses, only in numbers, and numbers had always been kind to him. Now the estate echoed. Its halls were too large for one man. The marble floors gleamed, and every surface reflected light but no warmth. Servants came and went like whispers. Few spoke to him for long. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't approachable either. The young heir had a way of keeping distance even when he smiled, a defense he didn't know he wore. He had been educated in Boston, refined in London, but when he returned to the desert, he felt both master and stranger. Every night he would walk the veranda and look out across the Black Hills where coyote howls rose like broken hymns. The desert should have comforted him. It was his blood, his belonging, but instead it felt like a reminder of something forgotten. Among the heirlooms in the main hall stood the ancestral dagger, a blade of obsidian and silver, mounted in glass. Its handle bore turquoise inlays and carvings of eagles and flames. According to legend, it had belonged to Talon's great-grandfather, a warrior who had vowed that the family's prosperity would last only as long as the dagger stayed on sacred ground. Yet the dagger now rested inside a glass case, locked within a mansion built on money and steel, far from the soil it once touched. Talon often looked at it while passing, a strange unease stirring in his stomach, though he laughed off such superstitions whenever the thought tried to form words. Visitors came rarely. Business associates phoned him, investors courted him, but few dared to visit Greyhawk Estate. The isolation suited him, at least he told himself it did. In truth, the silence had begun to press too heavily against his mind. The laughter that once filled the halls when his father lived had long been replaced by the sound of wind crawling through open windows. Then came the new maid, Isabel, sent by a distant cousin who promised she was reliable and quiet. Talon barely noticed her at first. She arrived one morning in a plain dress and soft shoes, carrying nothing but a small duffel bag and an air of humility. She worked silently, polishing the furniture, sweeping the sand that drifted in through the cracks, never meeting his gaze for long. But there was something about the way she moved through the house, careful, almost reverent, that unsettled him. Sometimes, when she thought herself alone, she would pause near the glass case and whisper something under her breath. Talon once caught the faint murmur of a word in Apache, a language he barely remembered but still recognized in rhythm. It was the sound of prayer. He didn't confront her, not yet. But that night, as he sat by the open window, he thought of her face in the dim light, the way her fingers brushed the air near the dagger as though sensing a presence he could not see. Outside, lightning flashed over the distant hills. The storm was coming, one that the desert had been waiting for. And as the first drops began to fall against the glass, Talon Greyhawk realized that for the first time in years, he was not merely alone. Something else had entered his golden estate, something older, quieter, and far less predictable than wealth. The next morning broke clear and sharp after the night's brief storm. The desert seemed scrubbed clean, the air smelling of creosote and rain. Drops still clung to the edges of the veranda, glittering like scattered glass. Talon Greyhawk stepped out into the brightness with his coffee and watched the sky stretch endless and blue as if nothing had ever disturbed it. But something within him had shifted. The storm had passed outside, yes, but inside the walls of his home and perhaps within his soul, a different kind of stirring had begun. Inside the kitchen, Isabel was already at work. She moved with quiet precision, her motions smooth, deliberate, almost ritualistic. She was young, no older than 23. But there was an old gravity to her, a stillness that made her seem untouched by the restless rhythm of the modern world. Her hair was black as obsidian, braided neatly down her back. Her skin held the soft bronze of desert twilight, and her dark eyes, when they occasionally lifted, held depths Talon could not quite read. He had expected the usual kind of maid, efficient, invisible, trained to obey. Isabel was efficient, yes, but there was something else in her presence, something that unsettled the still air of Greyhawk Estate. She didn't just clean, she seemed to listen. When she dusted the ancestral artifacts, old pottery, woven blankets, carved stones, she touched them as if greeting familiar spirits. When she swept the hallways, she sometimes murmured softly under her breath, her words indistinct, carried away by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Talon noticed everything. He was a man of observation, trained to read details that others ignored. Body language in a boardroom, tone shifts in negotiations. But Isabel was different. Her silences carried weight. Her glances slipped through him like desert wind through canyon cracks. He told himself it was curiosity, not unease, that made him watch her. Yet something inside him tightened whenever she entered the room. One afternoon he found her standing before the glass case that held the ancestral dagger. The sunlight hit the obsidian blade just right, scattering reflections across her face. She didn't notice him approach. Her lips were moving faintly, whispering. Talon cleared his throat. "Admiring the decor?" he said lightly, Isabel startled, stepping back. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to," he waved off the apology. "It's an heirloom," he said, studying her reaction. "They say it belonged to my great-grandfather. Some people think it has power." Her eyes flickered up to his, and for a heartbeat the air between them thickened. "Power doesn't always mean what men think it means," she replied softly. Then she lowered her gaze again and returned to her work. That sentence lingered with him for hours afterward. Power doesn't always mean what men think it means. It was such a simple phrase, but it carried weight, like something spoken by the elders he used to visit as a boy, before his father's empire swallowed tradition whole. He tried to brush it off, but her words clung to the edges of his thoughts, growing roots in his mind. Days passed. Isabel's quiet presence filled the mansion, smoothing over its hollow echoes. The other servants, few as they were, spoke kindly of her. "She's got a healing touch," the cook said once. "The kind of calm that makes even bad days easy." But Talon noticed details others missed. How Isabel always avoided stepping directly in front of the dagger's case. How she sometimes lingered near the open windows when the wind carried the scent of sage. How her eyes clouded when he mentioned his father's name. One night, Talon was working late in his study when he heard faint footsteps outside the door. He looked up, expecting one of the staff, but the corridor was empty. Only the flicker of candlelight near the hall's end and the soft echo of distant humming met his ears. A woman's voice, low and mournful, sang words in Apache that he only half remembered from childhood. A song of protection, or perhaps warning. He rose quietly, stepping into the hall. But by the time he reached the sound source, Isabel was gone. The only sign she'd been there was the faint curl of smoke from a smudge of sage still burning in a dish near the base of the dagger's case. When he confronted her the next morning, she met his gaze with surprising steadiness. "The house felt heavy," she said simply. "It needed cleansing." "Cleansing?" he repeated, unable to hide a hint of mockery. "You mean with smoke and old words?" Her eyes didn't waver. Sometimes old words remember what new ones forget. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched, taut and electric. Then Talon turned away, pretending to dismiss her answer, but deep down, something inside him trembled. The desert outside was dry again, calm and golden. But within Greyhawk Estate, invisible winds were beginning to stir. The desert had entered its quiet season, when the sun baked the land to silence and even the wind seemed too weary to move. Days stretched long and empty across Greyhawk Estate, and Talon found himself becoming more restless than ever. He had begun to notice things, small, fleeting, impossible things, that gnawed at the edges of reason. It started with sounds. At first faint, like the echo of drums carried on a distant wind. They came just before dawn, when the light was still thin and the air felt alive with invisible movement. The rhythm was slow, steady, too deliberate to be the groan of the old pipes or the hum of the generators. He would rise from bed and stand by the window, scanning the dark desert beyond the estate walls, but there was never anyone there, only the outline of the mesas and the shifting silver of moonlit sand. Then came the scent. One evening, while reviewing reports in his father's old study, Talon caught a sudden whiff of sage smoke, dry, sharp, unmistakable. It drifted in through the half-open door, curling like a ghost through the room. He followed it into the hall, down the stairs, all the way to the display where the ancestral dagger rested. And there, faintly glowing in the dim light, was a small clay bowl, still warm, filled with the ashes of burned sage. He turned sharply when he heard soft footsteps behind him. "Isabel," he said, voice low, "what is this?" She froze in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly before her. "It's only sage, sir. For cleansing. I didn't ask for any cleansing." His tone came out sharper than he intended. "You think this house is haunted, is that it?" Her gaze dropped. "Not haunted," she murmured. "Remembered." He wanted to demand an explanation, but something about the way she said it, quiet, almost sorrowful, made him hesitate. Instead, he dismissed her with a stiff nod, though unease coiled in his gut like smoke. From that night on, the house began to change. Lights flickered for no reason. Doors that he was sure he had locked stood slightly ajar. He would leave a room for minutes, return, and find small things moved. An open window where there had been none, a picture frame turned slightly askew, a feather lying where no bird could have entered. It wasn't fear that gripped him. It was control slipping through his fingers. Talon Greyhawk was a man who believed everything could be explained. Profit margins, weather patterns, even people. But this was different. This was the feeling of something watching him, something that breathed beneath the surface of the world he thought he owned. One evening, he sat in the library with the dagger case glowing faintly in the lamplight. He told himself to stop imagining things, that stress and solitude were clouding his mind. Still, when the light flickered again, he saw for just an instant what looked like a handprint, pressed faintly against the glass from the inside. He staggered back, heart thudding, but the mark was gone as quickly as it had appeared. The next morning, he caught Isabel polishing the shelves near the case. "Do you come here at night?" he demanded suddenly. She blinked, startled. "No, sir. Don't lie to me. I heard voices, drums, even chanting. You think I don't notice?" Her expression changed then, fear, not guilt, flashing across her face. "You shouldn't listen to the drums," she whispered. "They're not for you," he froze. "What does that mean?" But Isabel only bowed her head, clutching the edge of her apron. "Please, Mr. Greyhawk, let the land rest, let the land rest." The phrase echoed in his mind long after she left. It sounded like something his grandfather used to say before his father fenced off the sacred lands for oil drilling. Talon had thought those were just old words, superstition, folklore. But now, standing in the cold gleam of his father's empire, they began to sound like a warning. That night, the sounds came again. Louder this time, drums and voices speaking in Apache, though he could only catch fragments. Spirit, protector, blood. He sat up in bed, sweat chilling his skin, and for a moment he thought he saw a shadow move past the doorway, a shape slight and human, Isabel's shape. He rose quietly, his pulse hammering, and made a decision. He would find out the truth himself. Tomorrow night, he decided, he would pretend to sleep, and whatever the maid was hiding, whatever old secret whispered through the halls of Greyhawk Estate, he would be there to witness it. The decision settled on Talon Greyhawk's mind like dust. Quiet at first, but impossible to ignore once it had taken hold. He could no longer dismiss the strange occurrences as tricks of light or overwork. Something was happening inside Greyhawk Estate, something Isabel knew more about than she was willing to admit. And so, as the sun rose over the desert the next morning, Talon began his plan. He spent the day pretending everything was normal, drinking his coffee, reading the financial reports from his lawyers, walking the length of the veranda as though his mind were fixed on markets and oil. But beneath the calm exterior, every nerve in him buzzed with anticipation. He watched Isabel closely without making it obvious. She worked as she always did, her movements graceful, unhurried, yet now every gesture seemed deliberate, almost coded. The way she touched the windowsills with the tips of her fingers, the faint whispers she spoke when dusting near the dagger's case, the careful avoidance of mirrors after sunset. It wasn't fear he saw in her, it was duty. That realization unsettled him more than anything. Fear could be manipulated. Duty could not. At lunch, he tried conversation. "You've been here 3 weeks now," he said casually. "Do you find the estate to your liking?" Isabel nodded, eyes on the floor. "It's very beautiful, sir. But lonely. Lonely." He smiled faintly. "You think a man with this much land could ever be lonely?" She hesitated, then looked up just long enough to meet his gaze. "Sometimes the land is what makes a man lonely," she said softly. "It remembers what was taken." Talon said nothing. Her words pierced deeper than he expected. He almost asked her what she meant, but stopped himself. Better to keep her unaware of his growing suspicion. Better to let her believe he was still the ignorant heir who slept soundly every night. So that night, he prepared. He waited until the household had gone still. The cooks retired. The gardeners long since vanished into their quarters at the far end of the property. The air outside shimmered with heat even after dark. Heavy with the scent of dry earth and juniper, he turned off the lights in his room, leaving only a single candle burning near the window. On the table beside his bed lay the ancestral dagger, freshly polished, its obsidian blade drinking in the flicker of flame. He positioned himself carefully on the bed, pulling the sheet to his chest, breathing slow and deep. Every muscle screamed to stay tense, but he forced his body to relax. He had to look convincingly asleep. Minutes passed, then hours. The candle guttered low. The house seemed to breathe around him, the distant creak of timber, the sigh of the wind against the walls. He could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs, counting time like a heartbeat. And then, footsteps. Soft, careful, deliberate. Not the hurried steps of a servant working late, but the kind that belonged to someone who didn't want to be heard. Talon's pulse quickened. The door to his room opened with a whisper of hinges. A faint draft carried with it the scent of sage and smoke. He kept his breathing steady, eyes half-lidded. Through his lashes, he saw a shadow glide into the room. Isabel. She was barefoot, her long braid swinging slightly as she moved. In one hand, she carried a small bundle of dried herbs tied with red string. In the other, a clay bowl. She closed the door behind her and stood for a long moment in silence, head bowed. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to chant. The words were in Apache, ancient, flowing, rhythmic. Talon caught fragments: ancestor, protection, curse, bloodline. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. She moved closer to the table where the dagger lay. He expected her to take it, to steal it, perhaps to sell or to perform some ritual for her own gain. But instead she knelt before it, her lips trembling as she spoke. Talon saw tears glint on her cheeks. Isabel pressed a hand to her heart, and then reached toward the dagger, not to touch it, but to hover her fingers above it as though feeling heat radiate from the blade. The air around her seemed to thicken. The candle flame quivered though there was no breeze. She whispered one final word, then lowered her head until it almost touched the floor. Talon's throat went dry. Every instinct screamed to sit up, to demand answers, but something stronger held him still. The sincerity in her voice, the gravity in her trembling, this was not deceit. It was devotion. The chanting faded. The silence that followed was immense, sacred somehow. Then Isabel rose quietly, wiped her tears, and left the room, closing the door behind her. Only when her footsteps disappeared down the hall did Talon dare to move. He sat up, his hands shaking. Whatever she was doing, it was no act of theft or madness. It was something older, something meant for him. And though he told himself he was no believer in old ways, Talon Greyhawk trembled with a feeling he hadn't known in years. Not fear. Not disbelief, recognition. Talon did not sleep that night. Long after Isabel's footsteps faded, he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the dagger that still gleamed faintly in the candlelight. The air was thick with the lingering scent of sage and something else, something metallic, ancient, and faintly electric. He felt as if he'd woken into another world, one that had been existing quietly alongside his own all this time, unseen. The words Isabel had spoken, those fragments in Apache, echoed through his mind. He knew too little of his ancestral tongue to understand them fully, but the rhythm, the cadence, the sorrow in her voice had struck something deep inside him, something that no wealth or education had ever touched. When dawn came, he went downstairs and found Isabel already preparing breakfast. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her movements slower than usual. She did not look at him. "Did you sleep well, sir?" she asked, voice careful, formal. He hesitated before answering. "I did." Then quieter. "You were awake last night." Her hands froze over the counter. "Yes, sir." He waited, but she said nothing more. When he finally spoke again, it was not with anger, but with the same cold curiosity he used when cornering a business rival. "What were you doing in my room, Isabel?" She turned then, and he saw the fear in her eyes, not of him, but of what she might have to say. "You weren't meant to know," she whispered. "It wasn't for you to see. I saw enough." He stood, the weight of the moment thick between them. The chanting. The herbs. The dagger. "You owe me an explanation." Isabel's gaze dropped to the floor. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she exhaled slowly, as if resigning herself to an inevitability. "You don't understand what this house sits upon," she said softly. "This land, your family's land, it was once sacred ground, the place where the earth and the spirit spoke to our people. But your father, he broke that bond." Talon's chest tightened. "By drilling." She nodded. "By selling the ground that carried the bones of your ancestors. He didn't mean harm, perhaps, but harm was done. The elders tried to warn him, but he said progress couldn't wait for ghosts." "My father didn't believe in spirits," Talon said, his voice hardening, though not entirely in conviction. "And yet the spirits believed in him," Isabel replied. "And when he died so suddenly, we knew the curse had awakened." The word curse struck him like a slap. He almost laughed, but something about the raw emotion in her eyes stopped him. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that you came here to lift it?" "I came to protect you," she said simply. "You carry his blood. The curse follows blood." Talon stared at her, unable to speak. She stepped closer, her voice trembling but steady. "The dagger is more than a relic, Mr. Greyhawk. It's a bridge. Your great-grandfather's spirit was bound to it when he made a vow that as long as the family honored the land, it would protect them. But when the land was defiled, the protection turned to judgment. He wanted to argue, to call it superstition, but every denial died before it reached his lips. The memories were too sharp. His father's sudden death, the inexplicable fires that had burned near the oil wells afterward, the way his own dreams had lately filled with drums and whispers. "So the rituals," he murmured, "they're not meant to summon anything, but to hold something back." "Yes," she said, almost pleading. "To keep it asleep." Talon sank into a chair, his hands trembling. He remembered the warmth he had felt when she chanted, the strange stillness in the air, as though the entire desert had paused to listen. "And last night?" he asked. "What were you saying then?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I was asking your ancestors to forgive you, to forgive us all. The balance is fragile, Mr. Greyhawk. You live on borrowed peace." Outside, a gust of wind struck the window, rattling it in its frame. Both of them flinched. The candle on the table flickered and went out. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Isabel whispered, "If the dagger ever leaves this house, the protection ends." Talon looked toward the hallway, where the display case shimmered faintly in the dim morning light. "And if it stays?" he asked. She met his gaze with a quiet certainty. "Then the house will remain watched. Not by me, by them." He didn't ask who they were. He didn't have to. Somewhere deep inside, beneath layers of skepticism and privilege, a part of him already knew. That night when Talon lay in bed, the silence felt different, not empty, but alive. Somewhere beyond the thin walls of the estate, the desert whispered, and for the first time, he understood that it wasn't the wind that carried those whispers. It was memory, and memory never truly slept. The following days moved like ghosts through Greyhawk Estate. The air itself seemed heavier, laden with secrets that now refused to stay buried. Talon went through the motions of daily life. Calls with lawyers, meetings postponed, emails ignored. But the world beyond the desert had begun to feel distant, meaningless. Everything that mattered was happening here within these walls, between him and the quiet woman who walked them like a shadow. He had demanded explanations, and Isabel had given him one that shattered everything he thought he knew. But explanations weren't enough anymore. He needed proof. Not the kind he could measure in reports or signatures, but something real. Something that could bridge the vast canyon between belief and doubt. On the third night after the ritual, the storm returned. It began as a low rumble across the horizon, rolling closer until the sky split with flashes of silver. The desert welcomed the rain in wild bursts. Thunder shook the foundations of the house. Talon sat by the window, the dagger resting on the table beside him, glinting whenever lightning struck. He hadn't placed it back in its case. Somehow it felt wrong to imprison it again. Downstairs the lights flickered. The house groaned with the weight of the wind. Talon rose, drawn by something he couldn't name, and found himself walking toward the hall where the family portraits hung. The air smelled faintly of sage and wet sand. He stopped before the largest portrait, his father, Wesley Greyhawk, painted in his prime, proud and confident, one hand resting on a polished desk, the other holding the deed to the land. Lightning flashed again, and in that instant, for just a breath, Talon saw movement in the painting. His father's eyes seemed to glimmer, alive, aware. He stumbled back, heart pounding. The lights flickered again, then died completely. The house plunged into darkness, and then came the voice. Low, faint, carried through the hall like a sigh. Talon, he turned sharply. Who's there? Another flash of lightning, and in its white blaze stood Isabel, her hair loosened by the wind that had crept through a cracked window. She held the dagger's empty case in her hands, her eyes wide but calm. You shouldn't carry it during the storm, she said. It's calling now. He clenched his jaw. Calling what? Before she could answer, another voice joined them. Not human, not entirely. A whisper that filled the space between thunderclaps, deep and resonant, like the ground itself was speaking. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The blood remembers. Talon's pulse quickened. What is that? He demanded. Isabel didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the dagger. Your ancestor, she breathed. He's awake. The words hit him like a blow. The storm seemed to roar in agreement, shaking the windows until one shattered outward. Wind swept into the hallway, carrying with it the sharp scent of rain and earth. The candle flames flickered wildly, casting long, twisting shadows along the walls. And in one of those shadows, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in the indistinct blur of spirit and smoke, stood a man. Talon froze. He knew that figure. He'd seen it in old photographs and portraits lining the estate's walls. The same sharp features, the same solemn eyes. His great-grandfather, the warrior who had first claimed this land for their people, and whose vow had bound it to their bloodline. The figure stepped closer, its presence cold and powerful, yet not menacing, at least not entirely. When it spoke, the words rolled through Talon's chest rather than his ears. You have forgotten the promise. Talon felt his throat tighten. What promise? The land protects those who honor it, the spirit said. But your father traded its breath for fire, its life for oil. The spirit's gaze shifted to Isabel, and now she carries what you would not, the memory of our covenant. Talon turned to Isabel, shaken. You knew this all along. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. Your father's death was the first warning. I came because the elders feared you would be next. I was sent to keep the balance, to beg your ancestors for mercy. The spirit extended a spectral hand toward Talon. The air pulsed, charged with energy. The bloodline stands on the edge, it said. You must choose. Continue his path and the curse will finish what it began. Restore what was taken and peace will return. Talon's breath came ragged. Restore how? The oil's gone, the land's been bought. How am I supposed to fix what was broken? The spirit's eyes glowed brighter. You cannot buy redemption. You must return what was stolen. Faith, not fortune. And with that the figure began to fade, its form dissolving into mist. The thunder outside softened to a distant rumble. The storm was passing, but its echo lingered in the walls and in Talon's bones. When it was over, Isabel sank to her knees, trembling. He heard you, she whispered. That means there's still hope. Talon stood frozen, the dagger heavy in his hand. He didn't know if what he'd seen was real or madness, but it didn't matter anymore. Something within him had shifted, something ancient, painful, and unyielding. He looked out the shattered window at the rainwash. When the storm finally died, the desert fell into a silence so deep it seemed unnatural. like the world was holding its breath. The first thin rays of dawn spread across the drenched earth, turning every drop of water into shards of glass. The world outside was reborn, glistening and still. Inside Greyhawk Estate, however, the air remained thick with what had been seen, said, and summoned. Talon Greyhawk stood motionless in the hall, the dagger heavy in his hand, its blade now dull and dark, as though it too had gone through the storm. Isabel knelt nearby, her eyes closed, whispering prayers he could not understand. The shattered window let in the scent of wet sagebrush, and for the first time, Talon didn't want to shut it out. He was trembling, not from fear but from realization. His whole life, he had been told that power was a matter of possession. Own more, build more, control more. But in that brief encounter with his ancestor's spirit, he had seen what his father never understood. Some things do not belong to you, even if they bear your name. The estate, the land, the wealth. It was all built on something sacred that had been severed. The very soil that fed his empire had bled for it. He looked down at Isabel, her lips still moving, her face streaked with tears and ash. He spoke to me, Talon whispered, almost afraid of hearing his own voice. He said I had to return what was stolen. Isabel opened her eyes, their depth calm now certain. Then you heard him clearly. That's more than most ever do. He shook his head slowly. How can I return something that can't be measured? I can't undo what's been built. You can honor what still lives beneath it, she said softly. The land isn't asking for your money, Talon. It's asking for your respect. Her words settled into him like water seeping into cracked ground. He walked to the nearest window and stared out at the vast stretch of his property. The oil wells, the storage tanks, the endless fences. All the things that had once made him proud now looked foreign, alien, as if they belonged to someone else. A faint breeze moved through the open hall, carrying with it the scent of rain and soil. For the first time in his life, he felt it not as weather but as breath. Tell me, he said after a long silence. What must I do? Isabel rose slowly. You must let the land breathe again. Remove what binds it, what poisons it. Your father's wells still pump near the canyon, where the sacred stones lie buried. Shut them down. Let the earth rest. He stared at her, startled by the enormity of it. Do you have any idea how much that would cost? How many contracts, how much of the company? Do you? She interrupted gently. Do you know what it costs to live under a curse? You've felt it already, haven't you? The sleeplessness, the unrest, the way the walls listen. He did not answer, but the tremor in his hand spoke for him. She stepped closer, her voice lowering to a near whisper. It's not about losing wealth. It's about finding your soul before it's too late. For a long time, Talon said nothing. The house creaked faintly around them as if listening. Finally, he placed the dagger carefully on the table, its edge glinting faintly in the gray light of morning. If I do this, he murmured, if I make it right, will the spirits forgive my father? Isabel's gaze softened. Forgiveness isn't something they give, Mr. Greyhawk. It's something they witness. When you act with truth, they see it. That is enough. Talon turned his eyes toward the distant horizon where the storm clouds were breaking apart. The land stretched endlessly beyond his estate walls, quiet, scarred, patient. It had waited generations for this moment. He felt a deep, shuddering breath escape him, a weight lifting one he hadn't realized he'd carried since childhood. He could almost hear the faint drums again, but this time they weren't warnings. They were steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm once more. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. I'll do it. All of it, Isabel nodded, her shoulders sagging with relief. Then the spirits will rest. And so will you. He looked at her then, not as a servant, but as a keeper of something ancient, something real. She had walked into his life as a maid, but she stood before him now as a guardian, the last link between two worlds that had once been one. For the first time since inheriting Greyhawk Estate, Talon Greyhawk did not feel powerful. He felt alive, and that was infinitely greater. Outside, the wind shifted soft and warm, carrying with it the scent of wet desert blooming under the sun, and the trembling that shook Talon Greyhawk's hands no longer came from fear. It came from awakening. The sun rose gently over the desert, painting the horizon with strokes of gold and crimson. The storm was gone, leaving behind a world washed clean, shimmering with promise. The land stretched endless and open before Greyhawk Estate, no longer harsh or hollow, but breathing, alive. Talon Greyhawk stood on the wide veranda, barefoot, his coffee cooling in his hand as he watched the light unfold across his father's empire. The desert wind touched his face like an old friend. It no longer carried whispers, it carried peace. Behind him, the mansion was quiet. The walls that had once seemed heavy with secrets now felt lighter, as if something ancient had been released. Isabel moved silently through the halls, tending to the morning with her usual grace. But even she was different. Her shoulders no longer burdened, her eyes no longer shadowed by worry. In the week that followed the storm, Talon had done what no one in his family would have dared. He called his lawyers, canceled contracts, and ordered the shutdown of every oil well operating within tribal land boundaries. There had been outrage, disbelief, panic, but his decision didn't waver. When the press demanded answers, he gave them none. When investors threatened lawsuits, he told them simply, "It's time to give the land back." Those words spread through the news like wildfire, turning him into both a villain and a legend. The Greyhawk Empire began to crumble, but for the first time in his life, Talon didn't see ruin. He saw restoration. He spent his days outside now, walking the land as his ancestors once had. He spoke with the tribal elders his father had ignored. Together they mapped out the process of returning the sacred canyon to its rightful guardians. Every signature, every relinquished deed felt like a prayer answered in ink and paper. At night, when the wind moved through the desert brush, it carried no drums, no whispers, only the soft hum of a land beginning to heal. Isabel remained by his side, though her duties had changed. She was no longer simply the maid of Greyhawk Estate. She had become its heart, its interpreter, its bridge between what was old and what was possible. Talon trusted her more than anyone. Sometimes they sat in the twilight together, saying nothing at all, just listening to the quiet pulse of the world around them. One evening, he asked her, "Do you think they're gone now?" "The spirits?" She smiled faintly, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Not gone," she said. "Just at rest. They don't need to speak when they've been heard." Her words stayed with him. That night, Talon took the ancestral dagger from the study and walked alone into the desert. The moon was high, white, and watchful. He carried no light, only the blade, its obsidian surface reflecting the stars. He followed the path Isabel had shown him, the one that led to the canyon where the sacred stone still stood, half buried in sand. When he reached the place, he knelt and pressed the dagger into the earth. The ground felt warm beneath his palms, alive with the faint hum of energy. For a moment, the air shimmered and he could almost see them, his ancestors standing in a wide circle around him, watching in silence. He bowed his head. "I understand now," he whispered. "This was never mine to own, only to protect." The wind stirred softly, swirling around him like a benediction. A hawk cried in the distance, and he took it as a sign. When he returned home, Isabel was waiting by the porch. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The look in his eyes told her everything. "Did you give it back?" she asked quietly. "I did," he said, "and I think they accepted." She nodded, smiling through her tears. Together they stood in the pale dawn light, watching the desert come alive. Tiny blooms, purple and gold, had already begun to push through the wet soil, defying the odds, reclaiming what had been theirs all along. Talon Greyhawk inhaled deeply. For the first time since his father's death, he felt no weight pressing on his chest, no restless ghosts, only balance. He turned to Isabel. "Will you stay?" "For a while," she said. "Until the land no longer needs me." He nodded. He understood. Some guardians belong to places, not people. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the desert, Talon looked out over his estate, his inheritance, his lesson. The world he had once ruled now ruled him in return, and he welcomed it. The drums that had haunted his nights had quieted. The whispers had become wind. The curse had become a covenant renewed. And in that quiet morning, beneath the golden sky of his ancestors, the wealthy young Apache finally understood what it meant to awaken,